How many times in the last 7 months have we begun a conversation together about events in the Middle East, about events in Israel, and then subsequently, of course, in Gaza? And how many shifts have you felt in your understanding, perhaps even in your feelings, in your convictions over the course of that time? I think if we were to begin with things upon which we can all agree, not easy, I grant you, but I think we can all agree that for the last 3 months or so, international leaders from pretty much every corner of the planet have been calling upon Israel not to invade Rafah. Joe Biden said in March that it was a red line. And yesterday, Hamas accepted a deal negotiated, I think, by Egyptians, and celebrations unfolded on the streets of Gaza, on the streets of Rafah, where, remember, many of the people living in makeshift shelters and tents have already moved 3, 4, 5 times. I mean, the notion of home is a long distant memory for many of, almost all of these people. And then the order comes in to evacuate once again. And the invasion begins. So I heard it described by an American diplomat this morning called Dennis Ross, who has one of those CVs that you almost need a PhD in international relations to understand. He worked as a Middle East coordinator under Bill Clinton, a special advisor for the Persian Gulf to former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. He was a director of policy planning in the State Department under George H.W. Bush, an ambassador, as I say, about Middle East expert. And he was talking this morning about 2 people. 3 people, actually, caught in a sort of triangle. He was talking about Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister. He was talking about Itamar Ben-Gvir, a far-right religious fanatic who sits in Netanyahu's government and who, along with another minister called Smotrich, has essentially had Netanyahu over a barrel since this iteration of his Israeli government began. And the third point of the triangle was Joe Biden. And what Dennis Ross explained, I felt incredibly powerfully this morning, was that Benjamin Netanyahu faced, or perhaps faces, singular, beg your pardon, present tense, a choice between those 2 people. He can either follow Itamar Ben-Gvir into invasion, into the situation that is currently unfolding in Rafah, or he can follow Joe Biden's instruction not to invade. Now, you might think it's too late for him to go with Joe Biden, but I read another analysis this morning, which I found very persuasive, and it suggested that Netanyahu, not for the first time, is trying to have his cake and eat it. He is doing enough in Rafah to say to the Israeli people, we stopped at nothing in our pursuit of military victory, but we are stopping now. And he doesn't actually want to recolonize the Gaza Strip as some of his more extremist allies do, or anything of that ilk. And I think that's probably true. But he does need to sort of play for a tiny little bit more time. When this government collapses, whether it's brought about by elections or by the desertion of those far-right religious extremists, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, Benjamin Netanyahu's liberty is in jeopardy. Not just his political future, his personal future, his criminal future. He could be on trial imminently once that government collapses. I'm not 110% across the domestic Israeli political situation, but that is certainly a very real danger for him, a very real prospect. And so it is against that backdrop that we read this morning about people believing that a ceasefire had finally been negotiated and Benjamin Netanyahu rejecting it. And that's the front page of the Daily Telegraph today. I find it helpful sometimes to refer to traditionally very right-wing British media in order to show you that this isn't an analysis that's coming from a place of leftism or objectivity or any sort of narrative or bias. Netanyahu rejects Hamas ceasefire. They describe it as a ruse after Gazans were seen celebrating in the streets of Rafah. The protests on the streets of Israel are driven largely by an increasing conviction that the hostages have been abandoned, that the welfare of the hostages was never really a priority for the man who was ultimately responsible for the security failures that caused or that allowed the October the 7th terror atrocity by Hamas in Israel, and that subsequent claims that everything he was doing were motivated by a desire to free the hostages have, in the minds of many, if not most, of the families of the hostages, have crumbled to dust. So what you have now is a warning to 100,000 people to evacuate an eastern section of Rafah. I mean, you could speculate about whether they have anywhere else to go, but obviously they can go to other corners of the same city, a city that once, I think, had 270,000. I must get these numbers right, actually. The previous population of Rafah, I think, was 270,000. There's currently over 1 million internally displaced and refugees there as we speak. So they need to move to an area where they're less likely to get killed. And it's an operation that is unfolding despite very fierce and explicit opposition from Israel's key allies. Most senior politician, Jewish politician in America, Chuck Schumer, has already used the word pariah to describe Israel before this very deliberate decision to reject the importuning of Joe Biden and David Cameron and countless other international statesmen. They've gone into Rafah. We've made clear our views about operations in Rafah that could potentially put more than 1 million innocent people at greater risk, said John Kirby, the White House's national security spokesman. The narrative out of Israel is that the deal was suboptimal, that it wasn't something they could sign up to, that it wasn't necessarily something that was on the table, that they couldn't do it and they couldn't do this. And that is the conversation that Israel will be keen to see pursued in Western media, when, of course, the conversation that we have both a moral, never mind a political duty to conduct is the one about the offensive, the one about the attack upon Rafah against the express requests of Israel's biggest ally in the world, the President of the United States of America, Joe Biden, and, of course, the British government. So those two biggest allies, arguably, on the world stage have gone to the unprecedented lengths of saying, in specific terms, please don't do this. Please don't do this very specific thing. And I think, if we were to be making a short list of things upon which we can all agree, that tension, that triangle, with Joe Biden on one side, Itamar Ben-Gvir on the other, and Benjamin Netanyahu in the middle, the three Bs, if you like, Benjamin, Biden, Ben-Gvir, in a bind. He looks to have gone with Ben-Gvir. So he looks to have lent towards the far-right religious extremists upon whose support he relies for power. They have said that if he surrenders, as they have chosen to call it. This is the fellow who we were talking about last week, bringing up sort of Old Testament style language to talk about why the people currently living in the Gaza Strip should be shown little or no mercy. He has elected to go with the far right religious extremist upon whose support he relies for power. So that's, to me, and this might be simplistic, and this will probably be the basis of at least one of the questions that I'm about to ask you. He looks to me as a disinterested observer who has, since October the 7th, said to you that I refuse to mourn the killing of a Palestinian baby more or less than the killing of an Israeli baby. I refuse to. And at some point, there is a statistical imbalance that becomes morally unsustainable. For me, that point was passed some time ago. But we haven't finished yet, it would seem, this morning in particular. But it seems to me that Benjamin Netanyahu has sacrificed not just the blood of tens of thousands of Palestinian people, but he has managed, in the pursuit of an entirely self-interested goal, a goal of pure self-interest, he has managed to detach Israel from its key allies. This decision overnight, this specific incursion into invasion into Rafah, aid being cut off, people already facing starvation and disease, having what paltry aid could still make its way into the territory cut off, pictures of Israeli civilians over the course of the weekend, acting independently to stop aid heading from the Kingdom of Jordan towards Gaza, reaching its destination. And Netanyahu has elected to prioritize his own self-interest, because what will another invasion achieve that hasn't been achieved already, or that hasn't failed already? We must shoot some more missiles. We must kill some more people. Certainly not going to bring about the release of any hostages, because that was one of the things on the table in the deal that was rejected this morning. It also, according to reports, saw Hamas pledging, and you're perfectly entitled to suggest that any pledge from Hamas isn't worth the paper that it's printed on. You're entitled to suggest that, although, of course, it makes a mockery of international diplomacy if you sign up for that completely. They were pledging not to undertake any violent actions ever again, which frankly seems unlikely, but that is what has been rejected this morning. So he seems to me to have decided that clinging on to power is more important than clinging on to alliances with America, most obviously, the United States of America, most obviously, and then the UK, who are always there or thereabouts when these conversations unfold. That is what he has done, and he has done it solely to protect his own position. Because if he doesn't, if he pulled back, if he respected Joe Biden's requests, then Ben-Gvir and Smotrich would remove their support for his fragile coalition government, and he would be out of power and possibly facing all manner of personal legal problems. So there it is. I know I started slightly tongue-in-cheek, suggesting that we could make a short list of things upon which everybody could agree. I don't think I've said anything there that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. I certainly haven't expressed much of an opinion yet, except to quote Dennis Ross, the American ambassador, describing that jeopardy that Netanyahu has found himself in, and really compelled to choose either to go the way that Joe Biden wants him to go, or to go the way that Itamar Ben-Gvir has chosen to go. I also don't think that describing Ben-Gvir as a far-right religious extremist constitutes opinion or editorial. I think that is pretty much a matter of recorded fact. And I don't think that anyone can really dispute the observation that by going into Rafah this weekend, he has, at least for now, nailed his colours to Ben-Gvir's mast and ignored Joe Biden's. So what does this mean? That's the question this morning. We have been, I say we, I'm sounding like the late Queen, but we have been stunned in recent months by the quality of contribution to this programme. I genuinely believe that some of the callers to this programme have demonstrated a better grasp of the facts of the matter than some of the professional, quotes, booked, end quotes, guests on other broadcast platforms. I have learned so much from you and have tried very hard to walk that tightrope between here's Marcus saying, James, you're a terrorist sympathiser spreading your pro-jihad, pro-caliphate propaganda narrative to suit to your majority Islamic jihad audience. That's from Marcus. That came in at 10:14 this morning, and after the next break I'll find a couple accusing me of being an intolerable Israeli shill. So that's the tightrope I walk, I think, rather expertly, if you'd allow me, a quiet moment of immodesty, but only because of the quality of the calls that you make to the programme, giving me the facts and the understanding, the opinions and the ideas that I need to assemble a form of consensus. And today that consensus is this. Benjamin Netanyahu has chosen Itamar Ben-Gvir, a far-right religious extremist, over Joe Biden, the president of a country that has offered so much support to Israel over the years that many Americans remain deeply, deeply unhappy with Joe Biden. It's an electoral issue from the other end of the spectrum. So what does this mean now? The decision to go into Rafah, the decision to ignore Joe Biden's requests, the decision to, well, as the White House National Security spokesman said, we've made clear our views about operations in Rafah that could potentially put more than 1 million innocent people at greater risk. And they've gone in. Partly because people like Ben-Gvir don't believe in the notion, the concept, or the existence of an innocent Palestinian in Gaza. So what does this mean now? this decision, not just the military decision, not just the logistical decision, but crucially the political and moral decision to say to Joe Biden, nah, sorry, mate, you can jog on. I'm keeping the far-right religious extremists in my cabinet suite, because if I don't keep them sweet, my own